doctor's house. When Dr. Elias Greaves asked me to house sit, I couldn't believe my luck. As a broke med student drowning in debt, the offer seemed like a godsend. His house was enormous, an old Victorian mansion perched on the edge of a dense forest. The pay? Insane for just 2 weeks of keeping the place intact while he attended some obscure medical conference overseas. "I'll make it simple," Dr. Greaves had said, his sharp blue eyes boring into mine. "Keep an eye on the house, feed Balthazar, my dog, and do not enter the East Wing." He said it so nonchalantly that I barely registered the warning, but I nodded anyway. The rules seemed easy enough. The house was more like a museum. From the moment I stepped inside, I was surrounded by polished mahogany floors, stained glass windows, and walls lined with shelves of dusty medical tomes. Cabinets displayed oddities, skulls, strange surgical tools, and jars filled with murky fluids preserving unidentifiable specimens. Balthazar, a massive black mastiff, greeted me with a low growl that eventually mellowed into indifference after a few hours. The East Wing was easy to spot. A single heavy oak door stood at the end of a hallway, its handle rusted and wrapped in a thick iron chain. I didn't give it much thought at first. The first few days passed without incident. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional groan of its old wooden frame. At night, I'd hear Balthazar pacing the halls, his claws clicking against the floorboards. On the third night, I woke to the sound of faint whispers. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear. It wasn't coming from outside but from deep within the house. "Balthazar," I called, but the dog didn't respond. Grabbing my phone for light, I stepped into the hallway. The whispers grew louder, leading me toward the East Wing. I stopped in front of the chained door. The whispers were clearer now, overlapping voices murmuring in a language I didn't recognize. "Hello," I called, the sound of my voice foreign and small in the cavernous hallway. The voices stopped. The silence was heavier than the whispers, pressing down on me like a weight. I backed away, retreating to my room and locking the door. The next morning, I told myself it had been a dream, but when I went to check on Balthazar, the dog was nowhere to be found. I searched the house, calling his name. My footsteps echoed through the empty halls, and unease settled in my stomach. When I reached the East Wing, the air grew colder. The door, which had been tightly chained the day before, now hung slightly ajar. A chill ran down my spine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Balthazar might be inside. Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open. The East Wing was nothing like the rest of the house. The air was damp and stale, and the walls were lined with crude shelves holding jars of murky fluid. Unlike the artifacts in the main rooms, these jars contained things. Deformed animal fetuses, organs that didn't belong to anything I recognized, and skeletal fragments floated in the liquid, distorted by the glass. The whispers started again, faint but unmistakable. They seemed to emanate from the end of the corridor. I should have turned back. I should have walked away, but something compelled me forward. At the end of the hall was another door, this one steel and reinforced with heavy bolts. It was slightly ajar, a thin beam of light spilling out. "Balthazar," I whispered, my voice trembling. No response. I pushed the door open and froze. The room was a makeshift laboratory, dimly lit by a single, flickering fluorescent light. Medical instruments, vials of strange liquids, and yellowing notebooks cluttered the counters. In the center of the room was a large glass tank, filled with a greenish liquid. Inside the tank floated a humanoid figure. My breath caught in my throat as I approached the tank. The figure was grotesque, its skin pale and translucent, with veins like black spiderwebs. Its face was misshapen, the mouth too wide, the eyes too sunken. But the worst part? Its chest was rising and falling. It was alive. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me. My ears throbbed, and my vision blurred. I stumbled back, knocking over a tray of instruments. The sound must have startled the thing in the tank. Its eyes snapped open. I froze as the creature stared at me, its gaze filled with an intelligence that was both human and something else. The tank began to vibrate. The liquid inside churned violently, and cracks spread across the glass. "No," I whispered, backing away. "No, no, no." With a deafening shatter, the tank exploded. The creature collapsed onto the floor, its body twitching and convulsing. Green liquid pooled around it, the acrid stench making my stomach turn. For a moment, it didn't move. Then it rose. The creature stood, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its head tilted to one side, and its mouth opened in a silent scream. I stumbled backward, hitting the wall. "What are you?" I managed to choke out. Took a step toward me, then another. The whispers were deafening now, echoing inside my skull. I turned and ran. The house was unrecognizable as I fled through its halls. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, and the walls seemed to pulse as if alive. The whispers followed me, growing louder with every step. I reached the front door and yanked it open, only to find myself staring into the same corridor I had just left. "No," I whispered, spinning around. The creature was there, its milky eyes gleaming in the dim light. "You woke me," it rasped, its voice wet and gurgling. I ran again, blindly charging through the house. Doors led to the same rooms, and hallways twisted back on themselves. Finally, I found myself back in the laboratory. The notebooks were open on the counter, pages filled with diagrams of human anatomy and incomprehensible notes. Scrawled in bold, uneven handwriting were the words, "Do not disturb the sleeper." I didn't have time to process what it meant. The creature was behind me. It lunged, its claws swiping inches from my face. I grabbed the first thing I could, a scalpel, and slashed at it. The blade barely scratched its skin, but it recoiled, giving me enough time to dart past it. I spotted a switch on the wall labeled Emergency Purge. Without thinking, I slammed it. The room filled with a blaring alarm and red lights. Vents opened, releasing a hissing gas. The creature screamed, its body convulsing as the gas consumed it. I didn't wait to see if it worked. I ran, this time finding the front door. When I emerged into the night, the house was silent. The police didn't believe me when I told them what happened. By the time they investigated, the house was empty. No lab, no creature, just a dusty old mansion. Dr. Greaves never returned, and I never saw Balthazar again. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the whispers, and I wonder if I truly escaped. The doctor's house. I should have known better than to agree to house sit for Dr. Edward Corvin. The man was a mystery, a reclusive, eccentric genius who lived in a sprawling Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town. He was well respected in his field, but his social interactions were minimal, and his house had a reputation for being peculiar. When he approached me, a struggling college student desperate for cash, I didn't think twice. "I'll be gone for 2 weeks," Dr. Corvin had said, his piercing blue eyes staring into mine. "I need someone trustworthy. Feed my cat, keep the place secure, and, above all, stay out of the basement." The first few days were uneventful. The house was cold, even in the middle of summer, and filled with strange relics. Antique medical tools, dusty tomes with cryptic titles, and jars containing things. His cat, an elderly gray tabby named Mortimer, followed me everywhere. The creak of the wooden floors and the distant sound of dripping water kept me on edge, but I told myself it was just an old house settling. It wasn't until the 5th night that things began to unravel. I woke to the sound of faint, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, perhaps the wind rattling a loose shutter. But when I got up and looked out the window, the night was still. The sound wasn't outside. It was below me. I stared at the door to the basement at the end of the hallway. Dr. Corvin's warning echoed in my mind. "Stay out of the basement." I tried to convince myself it was just pipes or the house shifting. I went back to bed, but the tapping didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent. By the 6th night, curiosity had taken root. I spent the day trying to distract myself, but the basement door seemed to beckon me. Every time I passed it, I felt an inexplicable pull. Mortimer hissed whenever I got too close, his back arching and fur bristling. That night, I finally gave in. The house was silent as I approached the door. My hand trembled as I turned the key I'd found in the study earlier. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air was damp and cold, carrying a faint metallic tang. My flashlight flickered as I stepped carefully down the stairs. The walls were lined with shelves holding jars of preserved specimens, old surgical tools, and what looked like handwritten journals. At the bottom, the space opened into a large laboratory. It was filled with equipment I didn't recognize. Tanks filled with bubbling liquid, strange machines humming softly, and a metal operating table in the center of the room. But what caught my attention was the tank in the corner. It was massive, its surface covered in condensation. Something floated inside, a shadowy figure barely visible in the dim light. My heart pounded as I approached, the beam of my flashlight shaking in my hand. I wiped the condensation away, revealing a face, or at least something resembling a face. Its features were distorted, as if melted, with milky white eyes that seemed to stare directly at me. Its mouth hung open in a silent scream, and its body was a patchwork of different textures and tones. I stumbled back, tripping over a loose wire. A noise made me freeze. It was faint at first, a soft gurgling sound. Then it grew louder, a wet, choking gasp that sent shivers down my spine. The figure in the tank moved, its hand pressed against the glass, its fingers curling unnaturally. The tank began to vibrate, the liquid inside sloshing violently. Cracks spiderwebbed across the surface. I turned to run, but a sharp pop made me stop. The tank exploded. The liquid flooded the floor, soaking my shoes and carrying the creature with it. It lay there, twitching and convulsing, before rising unsteadily to its feet. Its movements were jerky, its head lolling to one side. It let out a low, guttural moan that sent a wave of nausea through me. I backed away, my breath hitching. "Stay back," I whispered, though I knew it wouldn't understand. The creature tilted its head, its milky eyes locking onto mine. Then it lunged. I darted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. My hands fumbled with the lock, my breath coming in panicked gasps. The door rattled as something slammed against it from the other side. "Please no," I whispered, backing away. The rattling stopped, but the silence was worse. I turned to find Mortimer staring at me from the hallway. His tail puffed and his ears flattened. "Mortimer, we have to get out of here," I said, reaching for him. The cat hissed, darting past me and into the living room. Before I could follow, the lights flickered. The air grew colder, and a low hum filled the house. I turned back to the basement door, which was now ajar. A shape emerged from the darkness, its form illuminated by the flickering light. The creature had changed. It was taller now, its limbs elongated and its skin stretched taut over its bones. Its mouth opened, and a voice, wet and distorted, escaped. "Why? Did you wake me?" I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The creature took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. "You shouldn't have come here." I stumbled back, tripping over the edge of the rug and landing hard on the floor. My flashlight rolled away, leaving me in near darkness. The creature loomed over me, its hand reaching out. And then, just as its fingers brushed my face, Mortimer leapt onto its back, claws sinking into its flesh. The creature howled, its body convulsing as it tried to shake the cat off. I didn't wait to see how it ended. I scrambled to my feet and ran out the front door, not stopping until I reached my car. The police didn't believe me when I told them what had happened. They found the house empty, the basement spotless, and no sign of Dr. Corvin or his experiments. But I know what I saw, and sometimes, late at night, I hear that voice again, whispering in my dreams. "Why? Did you wake me?" The doctor's house. When I agreed to house sit for Dr. Victor Halstead, I didn't know much about him. He was my neighbor, a retired surgeon who kept to himself. His sprawling, ivy-covered mansion at the edge of town was the stuff of local legends. Rumors of strange experiments and eerie noises had floated around for years. But Dr. Halstead seemed pleasant enough when he asked if I could stay at his place while he visited family for a week. "I don't trust anyone else," he said with an odd smile. "Just feed the cat, water the plants, and make sure nothing unexpected happens." The request was simple, and the money he offered was too good to refuse. The house was as strange on the inside as it was imposing on the outside. High ceilings, dim lighting, and walls lined with shelves filled with old medical texts, jars of preserved specimens, and odd trinkets that I didn't dare touch. A single cat roamed the halls, a sleek, black creature named Poe. It watched me with unsettling intelligence, its golden eyes reflecting every flicker of light. "All right, Poe," I said on the first night, setting down a bowl of food. "You and me. 1 week." The cat blinked, as if unimpressed. The first 2 nights were uneventful. I explored the house during the day, marveling at the bizarre artifacts and antiques. At night, I stayed in the guest room, reading one of the many books I'd found. But on the 3rd night, the noises began. I woke to the sound of faint tapping, like someone knocking softly on wood. At first, I thought it was Poe, but the cat was curled up at the foot of my bed, its ears twitching toward the sound. The noise seemed to be coming from the floor below. I grabbed a flashlight and crept down the grand staircase, the beam of light slicing through the thick darkness. The house felt colder than it had earlier, and the air carried a faint metallic tang. The tapping grew louder as I approached the study, a room I hadn't spent much time in. Its heavy oak door creaked open, revealing a space cluttered with papers, glass vials, and medical instruments. On the desk was a journal, its pages spread open as if someone had been reading it recently. Beside it, an old phonograph emitted a soft crackling sound, though no record spun on its turntable. The tapping stopped the moment I stepped inside. I hesitated, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Hello," I called out, though I wasn't sure why. The room was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then I saw it. A door at the back of the study, slightly ajar. I hadn't noticed it before. Against my better judgment, I pushed it open. The air beyond the door was damp and cold, and a narrow staircase spiraled downward into darkness. A faint, flickering light illuminated the bottom. Dr. Halstead didn't mention a basement, I muttered, swallowing my fear. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended. Each step felt like a descent into another world, the air growing thicker and the metallic smell stronger. At the bottom, I found myself in a room that looked like a makeshift laboratory. Metal tables stood in neat rows, each covered with surgical tools, vials of strange liquids, and sheets of paper filled with incomprehensible notes. Jars lined the walls, their contents obscured by cloudy fluid, though I could make out vague, organic shapes within them. In the center of the room was a large, glass tank filled with a greenish liquid. Something floated inside, a humanoid figure, its features blurred but unmistakably grotesque. I staggered back, my stomach churning. What the hell is this? A noise behind me made me whirl around. Poe stood at the bottom of the stairs, its tail flicking. The cat stared at me, then at the tank, before letting out a low, guttural growl. "What are you growling at?" I whispered. The tank's surface rippled. I froze, staring as the figure inside began to move. Its head turned slowly, its empty eye sockets locking onto me. The glass cracked. "Not good," I breathed, stumbling backward. A loud pop shattered the silence as the tank burst, spilling the foul-smelling liquid across the floor. The creature collapsed onto the tiles, a mass of pale, sagging flesh and exposed bone. For a moment, it didn't move, and I dared to hope it was dead. Then it twitched. The thing rose slowly, its limbs jerking unnaturally. Its head lolled to one side, and a rasping sound escaped its mouth. A sound that might have been a word. "Why?" I backed away, my flashlight trembling. I don't know," I stammered, as if it could understand me. The creature staggered forward, leaving a trail of greenish fluid. Its movements grew more deliberate, more purposeful. I turned and ran. The stairs felt impossibly long as I scrambled up them, my breath coming in panicked gasps. The creature's wet, uneven footsteps followed close behind, accompanied by that same raspy moan. I slammed the door shut and bolted it, pressing my back against the wood. For a moment there was silence. Then the tapping started again. It wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the walls. I turned, my flashlight darting around the study. The shadows seemed to shift and ripple, and the tapping grew louder, more frantic. Poe leapt onto the desk, hissing and growling at something I couldn't see. "What's happening?" I shouted, my voice breaking. The walls bulged as if something inside them was trying to break through. I didn't wait to find out what. Grabbing Poe, I fled the study, slamming the door shut behind me. The house seemed alive now, the floors vibrating under my feet, and the air filled with a low, guttural hum. As I reached the front door, I heard it again. Why? I turned to see the creature at the end of the hallway, its misshapen form silhouetted in the dim light. It raised an arm, pointing at me. "You let me die." I yanked the door open and bolted into the night, running until my legs gave out. When I finally dared to look back, the house was dark and still, as if nothing had happened. The police didn't believe me when I told them what I'd seen. They said Dr. Halstead's house was empty, that no one had lived there for years. But I know what I saw, and sometimes, late at night, I hear that voice again, echoing in my mind. Why? The doctor's house. Started with an innocent favor, or so I thought. Dr. Elias Greaves, the town's most renowned physician, had passed away unexpectedly. He'd lived in a sprawling Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town, a place cloaked in mystery. No one ever visited uninvited, and he rarely ventured out except for work. When his niece, Rebecca, asked me to help pack up his belongings, I hesitated. I didn't know her well, but she seemed genuinely overwhelmed by the task, and I, always too eager to help, agreed. "I just need someone there with me," she'd said. "The house. It's unsettling." We arrived at dusk. The house loomed like a shadow against the fiery sky, its pointed turrets and narrow windows giving it the look of a watchful predator. The iron gate groaned as Rebecca pushed it open, and the gravel path crunched under our feet. "Thanks for coming," she said, glancing nervously at the house. I couldn't face it alone. "No problem," I lied, my stomach nodding as we stepped onto the creaking porch. The key turned in the lock, and the door swung open with a reluctant groan, revealing a grand but decaying interior. Dust hung in the air, and the faint smell of mildew mixed with something sharper, like chemicals. The main hallway was lined with tall bookshelves stuffed with medical journals and leather-bound tomes. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors watched us from the walls, their eyes seeming to follow our every move. "We'll start in the study," Rebecca said, her voice tight. The study was cluttered with papers, medical instruments, and jars filled with things I didn't want to identify. A collection of scalpels glinted ominously on a mahogany desk. "Dr. Greaves had a reputation," I said, trying to lighten the mood. "Brilliant, but a bit eccentric." Rebecca gave a humorless laugh. "Eccentric doesn't cover it." We worked in silence, sorting through the clutter. The light outside dimmed, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and deepen. That's when I noticed the journal. It was bound in cracked black leather, the edges of the pages yellowed with age. Unlike the other books, it wasn't covered in dust. It looked as though someone had been reading it recently. I hesitated, then flipped it open. The handwriting was meticulous, each entry dated. The early pages detailed medical cases, but as I read further, the tone shifted. March 3rd. The experiments are progressing. The subject displayed remarkable resilience. Pain seems to fuel regeneration. Fascinating. April 10th. The serum is unstable. Must refine the formula. Subject 6 didn't survive the injection. I slammed the book shut, my pulse racing. "What's that?" Rebecca asked, glancing over. "Just some notes," I said, sliding the journal into my bag. I didn't want to alarm her, not yet. We moved to the second floor, the narrow staircase groaning under our weight. The air grew colder, and the faint smell of chemicals became stronger. Rebecca paused outside a door at the end of the hallway. "This was his private lab," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, swallowing my unease. The door creaked open, revealing a room that felt more like a mad scientist's lair than a doctor's workspace. Glass jars filled with murky liquids lined the shelves, some containing unidentifiable organic shapes. A surgical table sat in the center, its surface stained and pitted. "What the hell was he doing in here?" I muttered, stepping closer to examine a set of syringes arranged neatly on a tray. Rebecca didn't answer. When I turned, she was staring at a large cabinet against the far wall. "It's locked," she said, rattling the handle. I spotted a key hanging on the wall and handed it to her. "Are you sure we should?" The cabinet door swung open, cutting me off. Inside were rows of vials, each labeled with a number and a single word: subject. Rebecca's hand trembled as she reached for one. "What is this?" she whispered. Before I could answer, the door to the lab slammed shut, and the light overhead flickered. We both froze, staring at the door. "Probably just a draft," I said, though my voice shook. Rebecca didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on something behind me. "Rebecca?" I turned slowly. The surgical table was no longer empty. A figure lay there, its form covered by a white sheet. That hadn't been there moments ago. "We need to leave," Rebecca said, her voice barely audible. I nodded, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the door. But it wouldn't budge. The lights flickered again, and when they stabilized, the sheet on the table was moving. Something underneath it was breathing. "No," I whispered, backing away. The sheet slipped off, revealing a figure that defied logic. Its skin was mottled and translucent, its features incomplete, as if it had been pieced together from parts that didn't quite fit. It sat up slowly, its movements unnatural, its head tilting toward us. "Help me," it rasped, its voice wet and guttural. Rebecca screamed, and the creature lunged. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy glass jar, and smashed it against the thing's head. It recoiled but didn't fall. "We have to get out," I shouted, dragging Rebecca toward the window. The glass shattered easily, and we climbed out onto the sloped roof. Below us was a drop too high to jump, but staying inside wasn't an option. The creature appeared in the broken window, its misshapen hand clawing at the frame as it tried to follow. We scrambled down the side of the house, using the trellis for support. Rebecca slipped, but I caught her arm, hauling her onto the grass. The creature let out a scream that echoed into the night, and the sound of splintering would told me it had broken through the window entirely. We ran, not stopping until we reached my car parked at the end of the driveway. Rebecca was silent during the drive back to town, her hands trembling in her lap. "What was that?" she finally asked. I didn't know how to answer. All I knew was that Dr. Greaves hadn't been the man we thought he was. Later that night, when I opened the journal again, I found the last entry. July 17th. Success. The serum is complete. The subject lives. But for how long? I never went back to the house, and I never told Rebecca that I'd kept one of the vials. It's in my drawer, a dark reminder of what we found that night. Sometimes, I think I hear tapping from the cabinet where it's stored.